Hey guys, it's time to cover a more complex form of alienation. You really can't get this form of alienation unless you understand the three more simple forms of alienation that I outlined before. So let's have a look at what we need to achieve. Our overall goal today is to explore some indirect, complex, and more deeply ingrained forms of alienation. Now, it might have seemed a little bit trivial beforehand when I was talking about alienation from labor, time, and the products of your labor. And you might have thought, well, yeah, I mean, this is an issue, but it's not something that's broad, big picture, and, ultimately devastating. But there are logical conclusions that we can follow now that make us look at a broader social context and perhaps look at alienation, how it's applied on a much broader scale, okay? So, we are looking at more ingrained forms of social alienation at this point in time. So that means, we're not going to write out standard form arguments, but as I go through explaining things to you, we are going to name, define, and interrelate key terms to form premises, which we do unconsciously, which then later combine to generate conclusions or arguments. That's what we're going to do. We're going to explore the relationship between an economic base and alienation from society, species essence, and the self. Probably worth taking a note now. I'll just tell you that one thing that's classic 101 Marxism is that there's what we call a dialectical relationship between the economic forces in a society, the historical forces and other things as well, but mainly the economic forces, and then the social institutions that occur at the top. And he called this the base structure and the superstructure relationships, and we'll look a bit more at that in the future. But that's actually a really useful concept to look at because you can use a lot of this theory in literature to explain certain concepts, explain certain things. Okay, and then we're going to reflect on how there have been examples of texts that exemplify these issues or can be analyzed from this particular type of perspective. Okay. Now, APK, so sorry, I'd like you to go through, write these down, score yourself on each success criteria. And then I would like you to draw me a picture that represents a cultural product or a picture of a cultural product that seems to be completely inauthentic. Inauthentic, not authentic, inauthentic. And that'll become apparent in the future, okay? Alrighty, now to truly get this, what we need to do is we need to remember the cycle. We need to keep in mind that there's this economic flow of steps and stages just going on and on and on in the background, and we're not really that aware of it. In fact, most people would find this really, really boring. Very boring. Now, let's have a look. We have a CEO, and in this case, just to make everything really clear, a CEO does not own a company, he runs a company. But in most cases, the CEO has stocks or shares in a company, which means that he owns the company as well. So here is the CEO of Gucci. He has capital. He has money. Money is a form of capital. He spends that capital on things he needs to make products, such as a factory, maybe resources, or such as cotton, of course, utilities such as electricity, and let's not forget, maybe labor. Lots of labor, actually. And he uses all these things to make products, which then are sold on the market for a profit. And this profit then gets owned by the shareholders, and you might pay the CEO a wage, or you might pay everyone their wages and everything like that. But the profit then gets given back to them, and then they reinvest that money in producing more capital because they use capital to produce goods, which then generates a profit. That profit then becomes more capital, and the cycle continues. And what's really going on in this cycle are some key things. We've got this is what we call a base structure of society. Things we need to notice here that often don't get discussed when we're talking about Marxism. First things first is that all of these different forms of capital rely heavily on technological breakthroughs. In fact, technology, which was the result of technology that has been the result of science application to automation processes, has been pretty much one of the major driving forces behind the production and reproduction of capital. Okay, and so therefore, in the base structure, right at the base of where everything happens, it's not just economics that's driving this cycle, it's technology. But the technology has to meet the needs of the economic cycle. Okay. Now, for something really complex, just keep this in mind. There's a dialectical interplay between technology and between economics. You see, it takes no genius to see that when science was applied to mechanizing the production of cotton in the Industrial Revolution, it enabled the capitalist class to become the dominant class. And it enabled capitalism to acquire more of a dominant position over a landed kind of feudalism. That's pretty clear. Most people would argue that's the case. All right. And in doing so, we see that technology actually enabled a different type of economy to become the dominant form of economy, right? Beforehand, the technology that was used was mainly about farming and trying to make farming more efficient, which worked in landed economies and basically didn't allow for the capitalist class to become the dominant class. This new technology comes along and it reinvents the whole economic wheel. But of course, capitalism, just like feudalism, requires technology, so it's going to spend money on that technology that allows it to reproduce capital. So here's the dialectical relationship, and I should probably map it out on the side here, so I'm going to add something extra to our diagram. All right. Over here, I'm going to say we have technology, and we have the mode of economy. So I'm just going to say the economy. The two duke it out, and we have a synthesis. These can be a synthesis, antithesis, probably not. It's probably a bad way of looking at it, actually. But I guess the real dialectical interplay would be technology shapes the economy, and the economy shapes the technology. And there's this evolution in history that occurs, right? So the synthesis is the particular stage of history that you're at as the two of these things kind of play out together. And we have a thesis and antithesis kind of relationship, all right? But don't forget, the technology affects the economy and the economy affects the technology. There's a dialectical interplay. Note here, this is classic Marxism 101, because what we're looking at are relationships between material forces, all right? And all this stuff happens at the base, and not many people are really consciously aware of it, but that's a relationship to be mindful of. So take a note. So always be mindful of the fact that other technologies are constantly coming online and influencing and changing the way that capitalism expresses itself and that capitalism is. And when you get really into an analysis of capitalism at different stages of history, you'll say there are different versions and different stages of history. And there's been that dialectical interplay between the two, between economics and technology, that have allowed that to change. Similarly, a good mature Marxist wouldn't say that everything is economically reductionist. Okay. It is wrong to say that this is the pure determining factor. It may be in the long run, but believe it or not, the way that we produce goods and services, right, is also heavily influenced by the ideas we have about how they should be produced in a fair way according to the way capitalism sees it. So there is actually what we call a dialectical interplay between society and the economy, right? More important, we should say culture and the economy. And anything that belongs to society, culture, or politics is what we call the superstructure. And anything that belongs to economics and technology is what we would call the base structure. So we have the base structure and we have the superstructure. Again, we would have to be totally intellectually dishonest if we believed that capitalism wasn't able to modify itself and turn itself into different kind of forms and survive. I mean, that's one of the that's one of the things that Marx completely celebrated about capitalism. He thought that was one of the most fascinating things about it. It's able to adapt and change. And the reason that he said that was because basically there's an interaction between the base structure, which is the technology and the economy, and the superstructure, which are all the cultural institutions that exist on top of it. Now, ultimately, he would still be pressed to say that the base structure, which is the way the economy works, is the sole determining factor. But let's not forget that the superstructure, culture, society, and everything like that, does heavily influence the shape of the way the economy works and the technology works. There's a dialectical interplay between the two. It's not just the economy, though that's probably the strongest force. All right. So that's something to keep in mind when studying this stuff, because basically societies and their values and their attitudes do play a role in shaping the way economies work, though the economy is still the stronger force. All right. Okay. So here we have a situation that Marx involved where when we look at society, we have to consider how the capitalist and how the worker engage within that society. And they are inevitably consumers of culture. They love watching things like films or any kind of cultural artifact. They consume technology. Again, we have other versions of culture where we have art and artistic expression. They consume ideas, ideas that are produced and disseminated through the marketplace, but also maybe separately from the marketplace, where like a large, wealthy philanthropist might support a right-wing think tank, and that right-wing think tank then lobbies for ideas and gets its articles published in the press. We have one of those in Australia. It's called the Institute of Public Affairs. Um, so that's something that was talked about a lot. And of course, science is produced in the marketplace because companies get involved in a large amount of science in order to develop and grow their markets by producing extra products. Okay, all these things in some way within the marketplace, within capitalism, become subjugated to the needs of this cycle, right? So in many ways, let's be really objective here and let's channel Marx. Marx was not 100% against capitalism. He actually saw it as a dynamic, flexible system. In fact, if you read some aspects of some excerpts of the Communist Manifesto, he's got nothing but praise for it. He says things like all that is holy becomes profane, and all that is profane becomes holy. He talks about the capacity to ossify things and make them outdated, but then he also talks about the fact that you can reinvent the things that have been outdated just to meet the needs of that particular point in history at the time. So what he's really saying is that you know, capitalism is flexible. It's extremely flexible, dynamic. It can change, and that's because it's decentralized. You know, you don't have one monarchy telling everybody what to do, and then a class telling everybody what to do. You've got this flexible, ever-changing, ever-evolving system of capital, just reproducing itself in ways that you can't predict. And he said that's actually one of the really positive things about capitalism. And in turn, it produces these products. So some of the products that actually come from capitalism can be quite positive. Some of the cultural products are actually good things, but then other things are completely alienated or alienating because basically they are the products of this system, right? And one thing we need to keep in mind is that all these products here are products of society. And all these products here, and keep this in mind for later on, actually allow us to engage in society. They allow us to become part of society and participate in society. Take a note. So these products are made in a capitalist system to meet the needs of the market, right? And sometimes the market can actually produce lots of positive things because that's what the market's expressing. But of course, you know, a lot of the times some products are made because they are profitable and they produce what's called exchange value, not necessarily because they are the best thing for the consumer. And that's something to keep in mind. So you're alienated from these products, but also too, they're not. Capitalism is not concerned with being authentic. Capitalism is concerned with what is profitable. And that is where the alienation from culture and ideas and things come from. You know, you aren't necessarily getting the film that is really trying to express some kind of deep, profound aspect of human nature. That's probably why you have public broadcasts, public broadcasters and subsidies from film commissions. Because in a marketplace, that doesn't sell. It's not profitable. Instead, the idea is what will have the broadest. You sell to what has, you create the product that has the broadest possible appeal because you know you're going to get the greatest amount of people watching it, you're going to make the greatest profit. Similarly to, you produce the phone not because it's the best product, you produce the phone because A, it's going to beat your competitors, and B, it's going to make you the most money. Now, you might be in a market where you need to produce the best product, or you might be in a market where you slowly trickle that technology through, even though you've got tons of more technology to come, because you know that you can exploit basically the consumer because of the condition of the market at the time. Art and ideas are disseminated and produced through, whatever's most profitable. You read newspapers, you read the news, commercial news. There's no, they will tell you that they publish the stories that rate the most. They don't necessarily look for the deepest, most hard-hitting stories. Again, that may explain why Australia has decided to have a public broadcaster, because it functions outside of the marketplace. Something to consider. And the same goes with science. The science isn't necessarily always about what produces the best outcome for the consumer. It's about what's profitable. So again, these things, the things being produced here, the cultural products, and also the products that determine how we interact with others, are being produced to meet the needs of the market. And they might structure and mediate how we interact with others. So what's going on here is something very profound. The needs of capitalism are mediating the technology and the ideas and the artifacts that we use to interact with others. There's not a direct connection that these products provide between us and others. They are, in a sense, mediating and controlling the way that we actually interact with others, because they have to meet a particular economic need. Take a note. So this is why I sometimes get really angry when I hear people say, "Oh, technology's got the issue." I mean, technology is agnostic. Technology is 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 purely the way it functions serves the needs of a particular society at that time. And if a capitalism has particular needs built into its system, then obviously the technology is going to appeal alienating to you because, well, it's got to meet the needs of the system, right? It doesn't have a direct connection to your needs. It's mediated by these needs, the reproduction of capital, right? So that's something to take into account next time someone slags off in technology. And I will say this is where we can do some really deep analysis, okay? You can watch the Terminator film. You can watch Frankenstein. You can watch so many different films. And most people say, oh my God, it's technology getting out of hand. And a clever Marxist will say, no, this is something a bit more symptomatic of our paranoia against our loss of control. And that loss of control is generated by this impersonal Frankenstein called the market, right? The reason why the Terminator technology, or the reason why we have a collective psyche that is afraid of technology, as indicated, by the popularity of the Terminator films and other like-minded films, isn't because technology is bad. It's because technology is alien from us, and we don't have the language, we don't have the knowledge of economics to understand how alienation is caused, so we immediately project our understanding of that alienation onto the technology rather than the historical and economic forces that made that technology alien in the first place. Take a note. Similarly to, I think it would be remiss for me to argue this. So we've got the market, but we've also got things that exist outside of capitalism in the market, okay? And it would be really naive of me to say it's just this impersonal Frankenstein-like monster that's mediating our experiences through others as it produces the cultural artifacts we use to interact with others. Okay? People are conditioned according to Marx by their class interest, by the experiences they have been provided by belonging to a particular class. They are also conditioned by their experiences within the market. So capitalism is highly individualistic. It's all about pursuing, well, if you were a free market economist, which is someone who believes in a very pure form of capitalism, not one mediated by governments, you believe that the individual is a individual, rational, autonomous agent who goes to pursue their own interests in the marketplace by buying and selling goods. Okay, that's what you believe. So there is no, therefore, kind of collective experience provided by being in the market that allows you to work with others and to understand wealth and wealth accumulation through, collective action. All right. And that's something to consider. So it's almost like the structure of the market, or the way the market works, provides you with experiences that determine how you view reality. Similarly, too, your class does the same thing, right? So if you're someone who uh, belongs in a upper class family, the interactions you have with others, the need to consume wealth, the culture and capital, the knowledge that you acquire is going to be very, very different from what you would experience if you were a working class kid. It's quite easy to say that there are a lot of really smart, bright, working class, able people who, because of their class situation, um, if we lived in a pure capitalist society, wouldn't have the same opportunities as someone who's born in an upper class situation. And likewise, your ideology and your view of reality would be determined by that because simply you've been immersed in different experiences, which in turn shape your view of reality. Take a note. So, this kind of class based experience and market based experiences, they create the superstructure along with the ideas produced by the market itself create the superstructure. Right? So the economy is working in the background, churning along, churning along, churning along, and it's doing what it's supposed to do. And in a sense, it produces these cultural artifacts that mediate our experience and shape our reality. And then we kind of have a particular view of the way that the world works. And we design our politics, our political systems to accommodate them, right? And we design our law to accommodate the way we think the world works. And we also develop our ideologies about the way we think the world should work based on these experiences that we have. Okay? And also, we develop our ideology based on the ideas that are disseminated. One thing I should also point out here is that it has been argued that if you are upper class or if you are very wealthy, you can, outside of the marketplace, fund philanthropic, so you can fund think tanks or organizations that produce and disseminate ideas to meet your particular interests in that particular class. So that's the case. But then let's not also forget that in our society we have unions, which I guess are working class institutions, which also can advocate and lobby for the interests of the working class. So we may have a juxtaposition to, these conservative think tanks. So time to take some notes. So unconsciously and consciously, the way we interact with people in society is being mediated by these objects. The technology, which facilitates communication, social interaction, or any other form of technology, the cultural artifacts produce, the ideas, the science. All these things are coming together to shape the way that we experience and interact with other people, right? Likewise, the way that we form our cultural institutions, and I should put things like, any cultural institution, it's not just about the law or politics, anything to do with culture. They're being shaped by the needs of this impersonal system, not by what we need directly. And that can therefore put in place a lot of things that seem confronting and not authentic to us. Unconsciously, we may know that perhaps we want to remove this iPhone and sit down and chat with people, but for some strange reason, the technology has become so ingrained in our culture that we just use it to talk. Now, I'm actually a big fan of technology and I love the mobile phone, but I will admit that it has become, it has replaced some really meaningful personal interaction that I could have, okay? But that's because the mobile phone has been pushed onto us through marketing and through lots of other things that allow this cycle to continue. So there's a relationship here between what we would call the base and the superstructure. Now, what has inevitably had to happen in capitalist societies as well is that sometimes capitalism has gone too far. I mean, sometimes there are just things that people are not ready to tolerate, like a, a, in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people were working 16 to 20 hour days and getting paid not enough to feed their family. So, of course, there's a dialectical interplay. What happened? There was a reform movement where basically the governments of the day said, all right, 8 hours work, 8 hours play, blah, blah, blah. And in Australia, the labour movement got into power, reflected on what was going on here in the economy and tried to reform it, tried to make it better. So the Labor Party introduced the first minimum wage. Things like that started happening. And again, we get what we call a dialectical interplay. But let's not forget, though, that there still is this inauthenticity because the things that are being produced to decide what our culture is, they're not actually directly produced for what they are in and of themselves. They're not produced authentically. They're produced to meet the needs of that, and also they're produced to meet the needs of whatever particular class is dominant at the time. Okay, take a note. Now, Marx, in the philosophical and economic manuscripts, takes this one step forward, and he says, really, this is a tragedy because it means that we're alienated from our species' essence. All economic activity, according to Marx, is a social endeavor. And it's true. I mean, you think about it, business. A business doesn't just profit from its own internal activity. A business relies on externalities to profit. It just does. It uses roads, it uses the education system, it uses health to keep its workers going, it uses a lot of things it doesn't pay for in order to make money, right? And the combination of a business along with other externalities is a good thing because it allows for flexible, dynamic production of capital, which generates wealth. And so there's a great interaction that goes there. But at the same time, you can't argue that economic activity is just the pursuit of lone individuals, these kind of rogue Elon Musks that go out there and save the day. It's actually all an incredibly social endeavor, right? But of course, these things we do socially are not controlled by us. They're controlled by the impersonal market system, and of course, they are given to a particular class's wishes and desires because they have the ability to reflect the most need as consumers, and of course, they do disseminate ideas based on their own class interest, right? Um, so, in a sense, this social endeavor, this ability to produce things socially, is what he calls a species essence. Take a note. And he refers to every other species he can think of on this planet, and he says there is no species like human beings that produces the variety of products and other things that we produce. We are an amazing species in how we collectively get together and produce just a vast array of things. But we as a society don't decide what it is. A market does, and we are alienated from it. We are alienated from this decision. And that's an issue because that means, therefore, we won't find fulfillment in society. And where we could. So we're alienated from the species essence. I guess here too, we're also alienated from society. And these institutions that make up society are alien because in some ways they will come across as confronting to us because they serve the needs of that and sometimes, but not all the times, the needs of the class system. Not necessarily our direct needs as a whole group of society. Okay. The last thing to consider then is the self argument. I'll give you some time to take some notes. Now, this is where it gets really deep and really clever. Remember, Marx is a materialist, and remember, there have been so many other philosophers that call themselves Marxists, or at least have sympathy and borrow from Marx. Okay, it is a major area or discipline of philosophy in university, and people from all types of study have actually pretty much applied some Marxist concepts to their study. Now, this is probably more Hegelian than it is Marxist, but I still want to talk about the construction of the self. And there's this great psychoanalyst and probably half philosopher, quarter philosopher. His name's Lacan, and he talks about the mirror stage of development. And the mirror stage of development is really, really clever because a lot of philosophers used to think that a person, as soon as they're able to think, is, because you have a thinking subject. Now remember, I may have outlined this before, a subject is anything that's able to actively or proactively perform an action, right? Every sentence has a subject, object, and predicate. The subject is the doer, the predicate is the action, and the object passively receives the action. And this is really important for philosophy, especially according to the mirror stage, because what Lacan noticed was that there tends to be a point where a baby doesn't recognize themselves in a mirror. And then after that particular phase of development, there is a stage where they suddenly do. And he posits from this a really keen philosophical insight. The baby didn't know itself as different from all other objects until it recognized itself in the mirror. And from that, what he logically argues is that a subject, you can't really consider yourself as a subject until you understand yourself as an object related to all other objects. And that makes sense. Babies spent time developing, looking at how the world works, how people interact with it, and it's just processing all this information about social relationships and objects and everything that's going on. And it's having a look around and it's just trying to understand all of this stuff. And then it probably clicks, hey, I am a somebody. I am unique. And this self starts to development. When the baby acquires a notion of itself as a subject, the baby forms a notion of itself as a self. And that's really important because from this conclusion, we argue that the self is socially constructed. It's constructed after interactions with other objects and other people, and then meaning through those interactions is ascribed to is ascribed to you as an object, and all of a sudden you acquire this understanding, hey, I am somebody, I am a self. Take a note. Now, a lot of Marxists have loved this idea of the subject being socially constructed, and of course you would, because it's a material explanation for the construction of the self, right? But when we talk about what the self is, that's a deeply, deeply philosophical question, all right? And from a Marxist point of view, and it's pretty easy to understand this, the self is socially constructed. It's constructed through social interaction. And it's constructed through interactions between the products of social labor. Take a note. Now, as we said before, the forces of capitalism are mediating the construction of these objects that we use to construct our notion of self. A classic example from 15 million credits was the avatars that people were consuming to create a virtual self that would interact with other people, right? Now, obviously, all these signs and symbols and things that people are constantly acquired to communicate to the rest of the world who they are and to generate a sense of who they are, to generate a sense of self, are heavily mediated by what's available in that virtual marketplace, all right? And you look at your Nikes, look at your brands, look at everything you consume, look at everything you discuss, look at the technology you use to discuss things with other people. Look at look at the culture that seems to be the most popular, and people really reflect on it and talk about it. It's meaningful, but it's also highly profitable. So will other types of meaning be allowed out because it's not so profitable? Look at all these things that we use, these objects, these ideas, these things we use to construct a notion of who we are. You've got to ask yourself if it's heavily mediated by the forces of capital, um, is that necessarily the construction of an authentic self? And I think that in 15 million credits, we're kind of led to the conclusion that it's not. That the real person, um, or that the way a person is constructing an understanding of themselves is actually different from what they're capable of and from what they could be, right? And I guess that relates to Abby. I mean, you look at the forces of capital and what capital requires. I mean, what's profitable? A girl with an average voice singing her heart out because it's actually lovely and authentic? No, you need someone who can sing the Star Spangled Banner at like 15,000 decibels and screech it out and inspire everybody into this fake kind of, well, state of ecstasy. That's what makes money, right? So Abby then has to choose. She's only provided options. I mean, she does choose, but she's provided options for constructing her new self based on what is profitable. And she has to, of course, um, join the adult sex industry, basically, because that's what the market required. That's what's profitable, and that's what's done. And I think the fact that the protagonist here rebels against it shows that people understand that this authenticity is just really hard to reach. We can't get there. People are being alienated from themselves, and that's made uh, and that's exemplified here, and that's exemplified there. Even he became alienated from himself in the long run because he had to meet the logic of what capitalism required. He also had to construct himself through mediated products of capitalism, and his options were purely determined by what was socially available. So, you know, what started off as being a simple kind of explanation of people being alienated from time, work, and products of their labor has now quickly turned into people being alienated from the context of which they used to construct an understanding of how the world works and how they understand themselves. That's deep. And what you should really be able to think about here is, well, actually, I understand how a materialist philosophy can work. There's nothing in here, when you look at this huge kind of over the place mind map, that really is about an idea. These are all concrete material forces that come to shape the way ideas are produced. And these ideas that are produced then come together to shape the way that our institutions are produced, our cultures are produced, and other ideas are produced. And sure, not over the long run, but in the short term, these institutions will have a say in how the economy works. But overall, the relationship tends to be about material forces shaping the way the immaterial works. But ultimately, too, how we exist existentially, how we are, how we be. It's not just a philosophy about what is bad politically, it's about how we exist in the world. And that's why it is a philosophy. It's not just a politics or a form of philosophy, a form of sociology. Okay, so let's go back. Did we name, define, and interrelate key terms to form premises and arguments? Yes, we did. The premises weren't explicitly stated, but you've been taking notes. And I bet you've been taking premises, and then in those premises, bang, all of a sudden conclusions form. Did we look at the relationships between the economic base and society and the species essence and the self? Yes. And we understood too that there's a dialectical interplay. It's not a economically reductionist model here where it's just the economy that determines everything. Society and species essence and the self, they play a role in shaping the way the economy works. But also the economy plays a major role in determining how society works, how we govern our collective efforts to produce things, and how we construct ourselves. And you could argue, though, that the major player here is the economy. It has a stronger force in the long run. Did we reflect on how a text has exemplified all these forms of alienation? Yes, we have, and we did it here. Alienation from the products that we use to construct ourselves, but alienation from society as well and the institutions. And alienation from the options that we have available, and a sheer sense of authenticity that lets us know that perhaps the self is actually alienated from what the self could be. So we've achieved that. Take some notes, and I know this was a bit of a deep lecture, but it kind of had to be because we needed to get really into the theory. Okay? Cheers.